Okay, time to get started. I'd like to welcome everyone who has logged in, and I'm sure a few more will be logging in the next couple of minutes. But welcome to this event sponsored by the OU Center for the Americas on race, massacre, and historical memory, the case of Guatemala. The origins of this are both in an ongoing concern for human rights and transitional justice in countries in the Americas. Um, but also, this was sparked by the OU Tulsa Race Massacre Centennial and its commemoration. Um, and so we sought to do something regarding the Americas that would be related to this commemoration of the Tulsa Race Massacre. And you'll hear a little bit more about that a little bit later in comments from Jessica Cerezo Roman. Um, Another connection, if you will, another source of interest of ours is perhaps also personal. And I remember teaching the first semester here when I first came as an assistant professor. And that very first spring that I was teaching, in the midst of our semester on the 26th of April, 1998, just 2 days after a report was issued on the experience of political violence in Guatemala that was sponsored by the Catholic Church. The bishop, Juan Jose Gerardo, who was in charge of that effort, was assassinated. And I remember bringing this to my students at that time. And as we were speaking with our speaker earlier today, as we were preparing for our event, Luis Rodrigo Salvador, he mentioned that he is in fact speaking from the office that was once occupied by Bishop Gerardi, and that he in fact, as a younger person, worked in that project. And so there seems to be a lot of interesting connections here. So let me introduce the event, but also in terms of the event, I just want to say we're going to be hearing from Luis Rodrigo very shortly. That will be followed by some comments by our own Jessica Cerezo Roman of the Anthropology Department. And after that, we will entertain questions. If you have a question, please pose your question at any time. You don't have to wait till the end of the presentation. In the Q&A function in the webinar. The chat has been disabled, so you have one way of asking questions, and that's through the question and answer function. So please do that at any time. Our speaker today, Luis Rodrigo Salvador, began, as I said, many years ago, working for the Human Rights Office of the Archbishop of Guatemala as part of something known as the Recovery of Historical Memory Project. And he eventually became the leader of its forensic anthropology team. He later worked in the Center for Legal Action and Human Rights as an investigator for the Program of Justice and Reconciliation. And more recently, he's been working for the Public Prosecutor's Office doing criminal analysis, and currently for the Public Prosecutor for Human Rights doing strategic analysis and special investigations, among which are investigations of people who have been disappeared and lost during and killed during the recent periods of violence. He also teaches forensic science and criminal investigation at the University of Occidente in Guatemala. He's worked as a political analyst for a kind of grassroots agricultural organization called the Social and Popular Assembly, and has been working recently with a lawyers group for human rights in Guatemala. So we're very pleased to have him with us. He will be speaking in Spanish. Many of the slides will contain both Spanish and English texts, and I will be following his comments in each case with a consecutive English translation. There's no simultaneous translation in this event. So please join me in welcoming Luis Rodrigo Salvador as he begins discussing the armed conflict in Guatemala and its outcomes. Thank you.
Okay. Good evening, everybody. Voy a hablar en mi idioma materno porque me siento más cómodo de esta forma para desarrollar las ideas que traigo para ustedes.
So just to sum that, he just in his native language because he feels he can better express the ideas that he wants to communicate.
But I do speak English very well. Voy a darle lectura a unas hipótesis sobre el conflicto armado interno, hipótesis que fueron las que guiaron el proyecto de recuperación de la memoria histórica REMI. La voy a leer yo en español y Charles o Carlos le va a traducir al inglés.
So he's going to present now several hypotheses about the internal domestic armed conflict in Guatemala. These were hypotheses that guided the Recovery of Historic Memory project. He's going to develop them in Spanish, and I will try to summarize in English.
Ok. Vamos a la número 1. Bueno, la primera es que una lectura del contexto mundial en que surge el conflicto armado interno en Guatemala, 32 años duró, o 34, muestra la existencia de dos bloques internacionales confrontados, lo que le da un carácter general al conflicto local, situándolo en un esquema que ya estaba diseñado de polarización, mientras que desde el punto de vista endógeno, las contradicciones internas de la misma sociedad le dan al conflicto un marco local.
So this has been translated. I'll just summarize very briefly. We're talking about a conflict that lasted 32 years. And it's a conflict which has both an international dimension and a domestic politics dimension. And internationally, it was in the context of the Cold War, of two international blocs in confrontation that gave a framework for the conflict, a polarizing framework for the conflict, and the internal contradictions and conflicts within Guatemalan society gave it its local character.
Un aspecto central de esta hipótesis es obviamente que el conflicto surge y es producto de dos marcos de confrontación. Uno, obviamente, la Guerra Fría, y el otro, todas aquellas condiciones internas de la sociedad guatemalteca que llevaron a que existiera un conflicto de tantos años de duración. Como vamos a ver a lo largo de la presentación, algunos dicen que el conflicto duró 36 años, las cifras oficiales dicen 34, pero muchas veces hay una diferencia entre las cifras que dicen los libros de historia o a veces los gobiernos y las cifras reales de un conflicto. Es diferente el tiempo social que el tiempo político.
So he reiterates the idea that we have this overall context of the Cold War and its polarizing conflict, but then the numerous internal contradictions in society, racial contradictions, cultural contradictions, economic contradictions that led to this conflict. Different organizations time the conflict slightly differently, 36 years, 34 years, but he says that the way that the people experience the conflict doesn't necessarily fit exactly with that chronological framework. The social time isn't always the same as official time.
Ok, vamos a la 2. El movimiento revolucionario, de ahora en adelante lo vamos a conocer como MR en la presentación, surge inspirado de estrategias globales de luchas de liberación de los pueblos, de la teoría de la guerra popular revolucionaria de los países de la periferia capitalista, y en particular de las experiencias que fueron exitosas en su momento de Vietnam y Cuba.
So the revolutionary movement that is part of this domestic conflict is one that arises in the context of liberation struggles and the theory of popular people's revolutionary war, um, that develops in the periphery, in the marginal areas around the more developed countries, and has as particular examples those of Vietnam and Cuba.
Este marco hace que a lo largo del conflicto surjan por lo menos 4 diferentes organizaciones revolucionarias que al final forman una coalición, pero también hace que la guerra tenga diferentes fases o momentos en los cuales las estrategias tanto de los revolucionarios como las estrategias estatales eh, fueron diferentes en el terreno.
So the fact that the conflict is born out of this framework leads to several things. One of the things is that there are at least 4 different organizations that at different times are fighting a revolutionary struggle in Guatemala. 4 organizations that eventually coalesce and form a coalition. But also that this long running war has different phases in which different actors play more prominent roles, and in which both the revolutionaries and the state use different kinds of strategies.
Thanks, Charles. Number 3, please. El movimiento revolucionario tiene una secuencia histórica que parte de la tradición marxista y revolucionaria, influyente en los gobiernos de la Revolución de Octubre de 44. Evoluciona y se diferencia doctrinaria y estratégicamente en varias coyunturas críticas a lo largo de las siguientes 3 décadas. En el 54, la derrota de la revolución. En el 62, la derrota de Concoá. En el 68, la derrota de las FARC por la primera ola guerrillera. Y en el periodo 83-84, la derrota de la URNG y la segunda ola guerrillera. Me gustaría profundizar en 3 o 4 de los aspectos que acabo de leer después de que Charles lo traduzca.
Yeah. So the revolutionary movement goes through this historical sequence, again, as you can see translated here. The first important moment of which is the October Revolution of 1944, in which military officers and civilians overthrew a previously existing dictatorship and began democratic elections. Then the 1954 defeat of that democratically elected government and the imposition of military rule again. The 1962 defeat of a group of guerrillas at Concois. The 1968 defeat of the Revolutionary Armed Forces and the first guerrilla wave, and the final 1983-84 defeat of the second guerrilla wave.
Bueno, como bien dijo Charles, en 1944 Guatemala entra al siglo XX. Un grupo de estudiantes de la universidad, otro grupo de ciudadanos e incluso militares derrocan a un dictador que existía en Guatemala a mediados del siglo pasado, y de esta manera Guatemala entra al siglo XX con la revolución del 44. Pero después de eso, en el 54, se da un golpe de Estado, apoyado incluso por Estados Unidos, en contra de los gobiernos producto de la revolución. Poco a poco, o mejor dicho, paulatinamente, el sistema político empieza a degradarse, a corromperse, y se cierran los espacios políticos. De esta manera llegamos al año 1962, cuando se da un primer alzamiento verdaderamente revolucionario. Ya se levantan un grupo de estudiantes, de militares, etcétera, con banderas de hacer cambios estructurales en el país. En el 68, cuando mencioné que fue la derrota de las FARC y la primera ola guerrillera, me refería a que en ese momento se derrota la teoría del foco guerrillero o del foquismo. Y en el 83, la derrota militar, no política, de URNG, cabalmente se da a raíz de las políticas genocidas de los gobiernos y se derrota también a la teoría del frentismo guerrillero. Son dos cosas diferentes. El foco, teoría del Che Guevara, y el frente guerrillero es otra modalidad.
Okay, so one way of thinking about this is that in 1944, Guatemala entered the 20th century when groups of students and others rose up and overthrew the long-standing dictatorships that had ruled Guatemala since independence. This, however, this revolutionary movement, which issued forth in two elected governments, was overthrown in a coup in 1954 that was supported and organized by the United States against this revolution. That government entered into a spiral of corruption, and by 1962, all of the political spaces had been closed, and this closing of political space led to the first revolutionary uprising. This again combined students with military actors, and they were seeking structural change. They were defeated. In 1968, the first guerrilla wave, which was of a Foquista nature, of the Foquista strategy of guerrilla war, was defeated. And then in 1983-84, we see the military defeat via genocide of a different strategy of guerrilla war, the guerrilla front style of guerrilla warfare.
Punto número 4, que sería el siguiente. Me interesaría recalcar que el grado de vinculación o dependencia ideológica, política, logística hacia las distintas tendencias del movimiento revolucionario internacional varió o fue diferente según la organización. En Guatemala existieron las FARC, el EGP, el PGT y la ORPA. Voy a profundizar en eso. Pero este contexto tan variado es una condición necesaria para que conforme un ambiente político en el cual la correlación de fuerzas es insuficiente para explicar la existencia misma del conflicto, las modalidades que este sufrió y el destino final de este.
So, in this revolutionary movement, different revolutionary organizations had different kinds of levels of linkages and dependencies with respect to external actors in terms of logistics and political and ideological support. He's going to go more into this in a moment. But while this is important to know, it's insufficient to know this in order to understand the nature of the conflict, the existence of the conflict, and the way it unfolded and what finally happened.
En el marco cabalmente de esta hipótesis es interesante esclarecer, digamos, que existieron dentro de las organizaciones revolucionarias. La primera de estas fue el PGT, es el Partido Comunista Guatemalteco, que ante el cierre de los espacios políticos decide tomar las armas y sus miembros se vuelven guerrilleros. Si podemos traducir eso, por favor, Charles.
So the first of the organizations he's going to talk about is the PGT. This is the Guatemalan Party, or Guatemalan Workers' Party, and this is the Communist Party in Guatemala. When political action spaces were closed and there were no more alternatives, this Communist Party began a guerrilla conflict.
En segundo lugar, tenemos a las Fuerzas Armadas Rebeldes, que se establecieron sobre todo en la parte norte del país. También al Ejército Guerrillero de los Pobres, que se establece en el occidente, parte de la costa sur. Y para finalizar, la ORPA, que se establece en la costa sur y en las cabeceras municipales.
So we have three other organizations that emerge. We have the rebel armed forces, which is in the north. We have the guerrilla army of the poor, or of the people, no, of the poor.
Yeah.
It's in the west and in the south. And we have ORPA.
Ok. Todas estas organizaciones tenían obviamente vínculos hacia Cuba y hacia la Unión Soviética y variaban según el carácter de la organización. Por decirles un ejemplo, el PGT, las FARC, tenían una condición mucho más marxista-leninista, mientras que el EGP y la ORPA evolucionaron hacia planteamientos mucho más coherentes con la realidad cultural de Guatemala.
So these various organizations had various kinds of linkages to Cuba and to the Soviet Union, and they had different ideological tendencies and trajectories. As an example, the FARC was much more strictly Marxist-Leninist, whereas the ORPA evolved in a direction that brought them into much greater coincidence, if you will, with Guatemalan society and culture.
Tanta presencia guerrillera en el terreno hace que también en medio del conflicto surja protagonismo no armado, pero sí en cuanto a la reivindicación de derechos de las personas, de los pueblos indígenas, de la Iglesia Católica, por decirles un ejemplo. Y tanta participación política hace que la respuesta estatal sea abominable.
So, in addition to all of this guerrilla activity in the territory of Guatemala, there was a considerable amount of activity that was not of an armed character. Various kinds of popular organizations, unions, and the Catholic Church, among others. And it was in the face of all of this, both the guerrilla actions and the non armed actions, that the state reacted in such an abominable way.
Esta hipótesis se complementa con la siguiente, con la número 5. Y dice, el leitmotiv de la lucha revolucionaria, que es la justicia social, las luchas contra las formas de discriminación, la democracia política y el deseo de un nuevo orden internacional, involucró a otros actores, como las iglesias, los grupos de derechos humanos, los partidos políticos, en los dos polos de guerra en el escenario internacional, que a su vez tienen divergencias con las fuerzas radicales ubicadas en ciertas ramas de la economía guatemalteca, las religiones, por ejemplo, el ejército y ciertos movimientos políticos. A esto me refiero con que al final el conflicto no era solo Estado y guerrilla, había otros actores que eran visualizados como oponentes para el gobierno y que eran un atentado para el status quo.
So, at the heart of the revolutionary struggle, we have a struggle for social justice, the struggle against discrimination, the struggle for political democracy, and for a new international order. And these struggles involve all sorts of actors that are not part of the armed part. And this includes human rights groups, political parties, churches, and such. And these, in turn, are in contrast with other branches of other forces that are located in the business community, in the religious communities, in the army, and certain other political movements. And the overall point that he's making is that when we think about this conflict, we ought not think about it as simply a conflict between the state and guerrillas. This was a conflict which involved many, many different actors.
El esquema que acaba de describir Carlos prevalece o sucede en la expresión de una formación social particular situada en el continente americano, en Latinoamérica, por supuesto, y más específicamente aún en lo que conocemos como Mesoamérica, lo cual no deja que sea tan claramente marcado la práctica de la teoría marxista-leninista, sino más bien combina formas culturales y ascribe posiciones reformistas, incluyendo socialcristianas, liberales y socialdemócratas. Me refiero a que el marxismo-leninismo no podía explicar del todo las luchas que sucedían en Guatemala.
So this framework that we've been discussing, right, is a framework that comes out of a particular world, a particular part of the world, a particular historical experience, particularly Latin America and Central America, Mesoamerica above all. Um, and because of those things, this conflict is not so clearly a matter of the kind of class conflict of Marxist Leninist theory, but rather involves a number of different kinds of conflicts and social cultural forms, and leads to people holding positions that include reformist positions, include social Christian positions, liberal positions, social democratic positions, and such. In other words, while there is Marxist Leninism in this struggle in different places and different characters, one cannot simply explain this struggle in Marxist Leninist terms.
Este complejo escenario con muchos actores nacionales, ¿verdad? Las alianzas y las confrontaciones también de los bloques internacionales, mostró una lección geopolítica. Y esta es que eh, un régimen político de tendencia marxista-leninista no puede sobrevivir si no es a un alto costo en la zona de influencia natural de la potencia enemiga. No se puede sobrevivir en la zona, en términos geopolíticos, en la zona del oponente, un régimen contrario a la potencia.
So one of the things that this network of endogenous actors, that is actors in places like Guatemala, but also alliances and confrontations with international actors, um, showed that it is not possible for a Marxist political regime to survive in the area where the anti-communist party power is so strong, the United States, except at a very high cost.
En la diapositiva 8 vamos a ver que con el paso de las décadas, fueron 36 años de guerra, el movimiento sociocultural revolucionario fue incorporando o metiendo a su propuesta original de marxismo-leninismo otras visiones, otros modelos de sociedad e incluso modelos de poder. Y esto se manifestó a que dentro del mismo movimiento revolucionario, en cierta forma, también se desarrolló la teología de la liberación. Había influencia religiosa en algunos sectores del movimiento revolucionario y también cierta influencia de étnica e incluso feminista. Esto nos hace ver que adentro de la lucha revolucionaria había muchas otras luchas que, que no se visualizaban cuando todo esto inició.
So while many of the organizations that we were discussing begin from a Marxist-Leninist framework or begin from that starting point, as this struggle goes on over the 3.5 decades that it was underway, we see lots of other visions of society emerging, other models of society, other models of political power. We see this in the religious dimension with liberation theology and religious influence in the revolutionary movement, but also ethnic identity issues and views and feminist perspectives as well.
Para no seguirlos aburriendo, esta ya es la última hipótesis y la voy a leer en español. Dice, las necesidades de globalización del capital dirigidas a refuncionalizar los mercados de la periferia y sus sistemas políticos conjugaron factores que generaron espacios de participación y decisión dentro de un esquema en el cual el capitalismo triunfaba. Eran los años 90. En ese contexto, las propuestas progresistas de una nueva vigencia a los principios liberales de la Revolución Francesa, de los derechos de los pueblos, los derechos humanos generacionales, hablábamos con Charles hoy, y en particular los derechos civiles y políticos se revitalizan o cobran mayor fuerza al final de la guerra y suceden en un marco en el cual el capitalismo, por decirlo en esos términos, triunfaba en el contexto internacional, pero estas luchas eran y son vigentes.
So, in a context where capitalism globalizes and attempts to make more functional or refunctional the markets in the periphery countries, um, we have a situation in which the principles of progressive principles identified with things like the French Revolution, the rights of peoples, and the development of human rights after the Second World War, and in particular in civil and political rights and humanitarian law. All of these things get developed to a high degree. And so while, if you will, the question of capitalism triumphed and became definitive, these struggles have remained ongoing.
Y pasamos a la siguiente diapositiva. Para visualizar de mejor forma las hipótesis con las cuales comenzamos, vamos a ver estas líneas de tiempo que tenemos en pantalla. Y primero vamos a ver que el proyecto REMI visualiza la guerra de 1960 a 1996. ¿Por qué comienza en el 60? Para la perspectiva del REMI. Porque en ese momento un grupo de militares se subleva contra el gobierno para derrocarlo, pero simplemente lo que querían o planificaban era un cambio de presidente o un cambio de gobierno. No había una propuesta revolucionaria en el momento. Esa es una primera periodización de la guerra. Todo estudio, Charles.
Yeah. So so now what we're looking at are three different efforts to understand this period of time, and the first is the Recovery of Historical Memory Project, REMI, and it has as its starting point 1960. Why 1960? Because in 1960 there was a military rebellion against the existing government, so it's the first armed rebellion. However, these armed rebels, these military people, were seeking simply a change in government rather than having revolutionary aims. So that's where REMI began.
La siguiente línea de tiempo nos habla de cómo planteó el conflicto la Comisión de la Verdad. Y bueno, una vez esta revuelta de militares es aplacada por el gobierno en el año 60, estos salen del país y se van a Cuba y regresan en el año 62 ya con un planteamiento revolucionario y con la formación de guerrillas. De esta forma, del 72 al 96 es como lo visualiza la Comisión de la Verdad.
So the Truth Commission, sometimes referred to as the Clarification of History Commission, sets the starting point in 1962. And that's because the 1960 rebels, when defeated, went into exile and went to Cuba. And they came back in 1962, but when they came back in 1962, they came back with a revolutionary agenda.
Y el autor guatemalteco Carlos Figueroa Ibarra visualiza el conflicto armado interno de Guatemala desde el 54, cuando se da el golpe a los gobiernos producto de la revolución de 44, hasta 1996. Y quisiera pasar a la siguiente diapositiva. Es aquí cuando les indico que los tiempos políticos son una cosa, son como los establecen las comisiones de la verdad o como los aceptan las partes en conflicto que sucedieron. Pero los tiempos sociales son otros y creería que el conflicto pudo haber comenzado en el 54 o antes. En realidad somos una sociedad llena de contradicciones, llena de conflictos, y parte de ello se debe a, a las bases tan injustas como está construida la sociedad, y vamos a verlo más adelante con algunas imágenes. Ahí tienen el link para los que quieran bajar ese libro.
So the third effort here is by author Carlos Figueroa Ibarra, and he begins in 1954 with the coup against the revolutionary governments that had started in 1944. Um, and this, he says, is where he's getting the idea, or he's commenting on the point that political times are different and how people experience things socially. And so some of the limits placed on the armed conflict may be different depending on the perspective one adopts. Um, the struggles that are we're talking about here, of course, have as their foundation, right, the unjust structures that Guatemala has had for many, many years. And we'll now continue on to the next section.
Okay. En la siguiente diapositiva, pues vamos a ver un mapa de desarrollo social que fue publicado por la Comisión de la Verdad. Y cabalmente vamos a ver que los departamentos, así es como está dividido geográficamente el país a nivel municipal y departamental, que están con una coloración más oscura, son los departamentos de mayor exclusión. Un poquito más claro el color, como gris, digamos, son con exclusión intermedia. Casi blancos son los 7 de menor exclusión, y blanco total es donde la exclusión es más baja. Más adelante vamos a ver que hay cierta correlación entre pobreza y áreas donde la guerrilla pudo desarrollar operaciones y tener más presencia.
So this is a map of Guatemala, and it's divided into its subnational units, the departments, and the departments are colored by the level of poverty conceived of here as exclusion from social development. And as you can see, the darkest areas are the poorest, the least socially developed, and then you go to the lighter shades until you get to the white area, where there is still poverty and there still is social exclusion, but it's the least amount of social exclusion in the country.
Obviamente, donde hay menos presencia estatal, es donde va a haber mayor subdesarrollo y más explotación. Es donde va a existir también áreas donde los movimientos revolucionarios pudieron tener más organización con las personas y las comunidades, y fueron las áreas donde se desarrolló más violencia estatal.
So where the state is most absent is where underdevelopment, poverty, and inequality are strongest, and exploitation is the greatest. And it was precisely in these areas that we're going to see that the guerrilla forces were able to develop the strongest linkages with local communities, and where the violence experienced was greatest.
Vamos a la siguiente diapositiva. Este es un mapa de comunidades lingüísticas. Es otra de las formas de entender Guatemala. Estamos formados por 25 comunidades lingüísticas, 22 de origen maya, el grupo mestizo o ladino, así como yo, el grupo garífuna, que es una mezcla entre afrodescendientes y personas del Caribe, y el grupo Xinca, que es una migración de México a lo que hoy es Guatemala. A lo que voy con esto es que es un contexto multicultural en el cual se desarrolla explotación. Obviamente los grupos minoritarios en relaciones de poder, pero mayoritarios en cantidad de personas, son los más desfavorecidos por el sistema.
So this map shows us the linguistic communities of Guatemala, There are 22 different Mayan language communities. These are different languages, but they're all part of the Mayan language family. There is one community of Xinca, who are a group that emigrated from Mexico, one group Garifuna, which are partly Afro-descended and people from the Caribbean, and finally Mestizo people. And what we see in a place like Guatemala is that the majority communities, the vast majority communities, are not the majorities in terms of power and wealth and privilege. Rather, minorities hold those. And so we're looking at a multicultural context in which much of the social conflict has a linguistic, communal, ethnic dimension.
El siguiente mapa va a expresar el número de masacres sucedidas durante el conflicto armado por departamento. Y vamos a ver que, bueno, el departamento del Quiché, el que está con negro totalmente, suceden 344 masacres durante la guerra. Es claro que hay una correlación entre el número o la presencia de masacres y los departamentos con pobreza que vimos en un inicio. Por lo tanto, había más desarrollo o presencia de las organizaciones revolucionarias en esos lugares y la respuesta estatal pues fue el desarrollo de operativos militares de este tipo. Tierra arrasada.
So this map shows us where massacres took place. As you can see, the darkest color are the departments in which there were more than 100. Quiché is the department with the largest number of massacres, 344. And then you can see some of the neighboring states with also very high numbers, and then parts of the country where there were fewer or, in fact, no registered cases of massacres. As he points out, the areas of greatest violence, massacres, took place in places where there was the greatest poverty, the greatest absence of the state, the greatest exploitation, and as we said before, the greatest development of the revolutionary forces. So it was there that the military engaged in just leveling the field, if you will, and carrying out lots of massacres.
En la siguiente diapositiva, pues vamos a poder ver la posición de las masacres en el departamento del Quiché y Huehuetenango, que fueron de los más afectados por la violencia estatal, pero tenemos un cruce ahí entre comunidades lingüísticas y los lugares donde sucedieron las masacres. Algo que me interesaría transmitirles, producto, digamos, de la experiencia que tengo en investigación, etcétera, es que las masacres que se desarrollaron durante el periodo de general Efraín Ríos Montt, año 82 al 83, en realidad suceden como una política de Estado, no en contra de un enemigo armado, sino en contra de comunidades que de una manera u otra apoyaban al movimiento, pudiera ser que sí, pero eran civiles desarmados. Es complejo, pero vamos a ir explicándolo a lo largo de la presentación.
So here you can see a map that has some of the linguistic communities in background color, and then the red dots are places of significant numbers of massacres. One of the things that he wants to point out is the timing of these massacre sites. So we have this very long war, but we have this very intense period of time, 1980 to 1983, when many of the massacres took place, much of this under the government of General Ríos Montt. The point here is that at this time, the government decided that its policy in terms of the overall armed struggle would be not necessarily to attack only the guerrillas, but to attack any of the communities that were perceived to be lending support or aid to the guerrillas. And so now we're talking about unarmed community members, unarmed civilians in villages in these areas that are being directly and purposefully targeted.
La siguiente diapositiva, por favor, Carlos. En esta, pues, vamos a volver a ver el mapa en blanco y negro, pero lo que me interesaría recalcar es que la Comisión de la Verdad estableció 669 masacres. Una masacre es aquella muerte de 5 individuos o más en un mismo operativo militar. Y también existen masacres que se producen dentro de la política de tierra arrasada, que implica no solo la muerte de las personas, sino la muerte de absolutamente todo, hasta en términos materiales, las casas, la comida, la ropa, etcétera, arrasar las comunidades, ¿verdad? Es interesante cuando uno analiza los datos fríamente, ver que de 669 masacres, obviamente la mayoría suceden en zonas de población maya, pero sí se registran en otros departamentos donde la mayor parte de la población es mestiza, como yo. Cuando uno entiende la lógica de la guerra, entiende que el Estado estaba buscando el control sobre la población a un muy alto costo, puesto que después del arrasamiento de las aldeas, retoman el control del área por medio de las patrullas de autodefensa civil y la militarización de la sociedad.
So here we're back looking at the black and white map. You can see the total numbers that the Truth Commission found. They defined a massacre as one in which 5 or more persons were killed in the same military operation. In these cases, what we're seeing is not just the murdering of people, the killing of people, but this was part of a policy of total destruction. So frequently, people would be killed, also their animals would be killed, also the crops would be burnt, also the homes would be burnt and destroyed. It was the destruction of absolutely everything in that particular place. This most frequently took place in the regions where Mayan descended people live, but also sometimes in places where the mestizo population was dominant. And it became clear that the purpose of the government was to exercise control over the population by destroying all adversaries and creating in the wake of this civil defense organizations and a militarization of society.
En la siguiente diapositiva vamos a poder ver nuevamente las masacres sucedidas en esta área y mapeadas, ¿verdad? En cada punto rojo es que sucedió una masacre. Pero lo que es aún más complejo del conflicto armado y de esta época, del 82 al 83, es que la cantidad de personas que mueren por hambre y enfermedades durante la persecución en las montañas es mayor a la gente que muere en los operativos de las masacres. Obviamente, cuando arrasaban las aldeas, la población sobreviviente corría a las montañas. Y al analizar, leer y trabajar en casos judiciales de esta época, pudimos establecer que incluso en los planes militares está establecido el destruir las siembras que pudiera tener la población en las montañas, sus refugios y todo indicio de vida que no estuviera sometida al ejército. De esta forma, el hambre y las enfermedades fueron tal vez el arma más efectiva del Estado en este contexto.
So this map, which is a close-up of one of the previous maps, looks again particularly at this period of 1982 to 1983. And what they found through their research and investigation was that more Guatemalans were dying of hunger and of illness than those that were killed with bullets. When a massacre would take place in a village, many would flee and escape with their lives, but they would escape into the mountains, and there they would not have food, not be able to cure their illnesses, and so a far greater number of people died that way, but still as a direct product of the policy of total destruction of the places that people lived, the food that they lived on, etc. Everything that was not under the control of the military was destroyed.
En la siguiente diapositiva vamos a ver una gráfica comparativa. En cuanto a la etnicidad de las víctimas de las violaciones a los derechos humanos durante el tiempo de la guerra. Y vamos a ver que en el año 81, 84 se manifiesta un pico muy elevado de víctimas de origen maya, mientras que las víctimas de origen mestizo es la línea punteada.
So here we have an image that shows us the number of people being killed or harmed or having their human rights violated over time. And you see around the time of 1981 to 84, a very large peak in the number of Mayan people who are suffering these violations. The dotted line is the number of mestizo people who are suffering similar violations.
La guerra fue muy compleja. En realidad, la cantidad de víctimas de origen maya responde a que si estas personas se sublevaban o si la guerrilla triunfaba, esta enorme finca en la que vivimos en este país se hubiera quedado sin mano de obra. Es injusto, pero así piensan o pensaban en ese entonces. El conflicto también tiene varias etapas. No solamente se desarrolla en las montañas o en las áreas indígenas, también tiene etapas donde la violencia se desarrolló en las ciudades, en los centros urbanos. A lo largo de más de 3 décadas tuvo que haber tenido diferentes facetas, diferentes actores, no solo el ejército, también la policía militar ambulante, policía judicial, también habían diferentes actores con diferentes modus operandi dentro del Estado durante el conflicto armado interno.
So this was a very complex war over many years with many different actors, many different dynamics, many different phases in different parts of the country. We see many of the quantity of victims among the Mayan people being strongly related to whether there was rebellion in that region or not. And just as there were many people who were experiencing this kind of violence in the mountainous areas and the indigenous areas, during some periods, there were other periods when the conflict was more in the cities and affecting more of the mestizo population. So there are many different parts to the story.
A continuación vamos a ver un poco de información sobre el proyecto de recuperación de la memoria histórica en la siguiente diapositiva. Y bueno, situándonos en el año 94, aún no se había firmado la paz, se firma el acuerdo de paz que le da o le va a dar vida a la futura Comisión de la Verdad.
So we're now going to look at the project of recovery of historical memory. And in 1994, even before the final peace agreements have been signed, an agreement is signed among the various parts of the peace negotiators for the establishment of a truth commission.
En ese contexto, y al conocer el acuerdo de paz, pues cabalmente Monseñor Gerardi visualiza que la Comisión de la Verdad va a tener como un año o un año y medio para trabajar, teniendo que investigar un periodo de tiempo largo y muy complejo, como vimos ahorita, ¿verdad? Entonces presenta la iniciativa desde la Iglesia Católica del proyecto de recuperación de la memoria histórica.
So, as Bishop Gerardi was observing this, he realized that this Truth Commission was going to have a year, maybe a year and a half, to do all the research and investigation about this very long period of time and this very complex process of struggle and violence. And he proposed that the church undertake a slightly different kind of understanding and work on it for a longer period of time.
De esa forma presenta el proyecto de manera pública en el año de 1995 y se inicia una investigación grande en la cual colaboran varias diócesis del país. El proyecto no utilizaba, no trabajaban en él, digamos, personas extranjeras, sino los entrevistadores eran los catequistas o las personas de iglesia en las comunidades.
So he publicly announced this project in 1995. It received a great deal of support. Many people of great talent and skill worked in this. One of the characteristics was that the people doing the interviewing and researching, in many cases, were not people from outside of the communities, but members of the community, catechists and other members of the local church who were known to the community were doing a lot of the interviewing.
En el año de 1996, yo era joven y tenía 19 años y entré a trabajar cabalmente a este equipo en esta oficina.
And he himself, Luis Rigo, was 19 years old in 1996, and he began working in this community, in this organization, in the very offices where he is now speaking to us from.
Y se desarrolla una investigación, un método de trabajo impresionante que alternaba los métodos cualitativos de investigación con los métodos cuantitativos, la entrevista, informantes clave, el testimonio, investigación hemerográfica. Es enorme el proyecto, sus alcances fueron bastante grandes y se presentan resultados por informe el 24 de abril del 98.
So this was a huge, huge project, and many different kinds of methodologies were used: quantitative, quantitative testimonials, speaking with key witnesses, all sorts of things were done. And finally, this was compiled into a massive report that was presented to the public on the 24th of April, 1998.
La siguiente diapositiva, por favor, Carlos. Y como producto, pues bueno, este es el informe REMI, que entre sus objetivos tenía el ser un insumo para la Comisión de la Verdad, para que ellos no comenzaran de cero, sino que tuvieran una base para trabajar. El tomo número 4, que es el que miran más en grande en pantalla, son las estadísticas. El tomo número 3 nos habla de los periodos históricos de la guerra, pero para explicarla, comienza la historia desde la época de los gobiernos liberales del siglo antepasado, ¿verdad? El tomo número 2 nos habla, que se titula Los mecanismos del horror, habla de bajo qué lógica se va formando poco a poco un Estado contrainsurgente. No un ejército contrainsurgente, sino un Estado contrainsurgente. Y el tomo número 1, que se llama Impactos de la Violencia, pues hace una aproximación a los impactos de la violencia estatal y de la violencia también ejercida por los grupos revolucionarios en las comunidades, en las familias, en los individuos, a nivel gremial y obviamente a nivel social.
So The final report consists of 4 volumes, the first of which looks at the effect of violence on people and various kinds of people's families, people who belong to organizations, all sorts of different kinds of people. The second volume looks at the methods used, the mechanisms of horror as it's described, how this violence was exercised. Volume 3 is the historical context, which goes back much further than we have today. It goes back to the origins of Guatemala's independent country and the parties, especially the Liberal Party, that dominated for many years. And Volume 4 looks more closely at the victims of the conflict and contains much of the statistical information.
Vamos a la siguiente diapositiva. Cabalmente ahí está, bueno, Monseñor Gerardi presentando el informe, ese 24 de abril del 98. Y vamos a la siguiente. El 26 de abril, 2 días después de esto, Monseñor Gerardi es asesinado en su casa por un comando gubernamental.
So, 2 days after presenting this report to the public, Monsignor Gerardi is assassinated in his own house by a government command, a government unit, if you will.
El caso se investigó y se llevó a juicio, pero tal vez me sacaría eso de la línea, digamos, de la plática del día de hoy. Y en 1999, la Comisión de la Verdad presenta sus resultados.
So there's a whole story to be told about what happened after Monsignor Gerardi was killed and a complex judicial process that followed. And Luis Rodrigo was one of the investigators, but that would take us outside of the purpose of today's talk. So we're moving ahead in that direction. In 1999, the Truth Commission presents its final results. Something I think I forgot to translate earlier was the point that when Monsignor Gerardi was presenting the results, the idea was that this historical investigation by this large team would serve as prime material for the Truth Commission. They would have a lot of the research done, if you will, that they could then use. So the Truth Commission then presents its results in 99.
Después de la presentación de los resultados de la comisión, pues ha habido sin lugar a dudas avances en algunos casos de justicia, sí han existido, pero tal vez son una mínima parte. Por ejemplo, en el 2013 se dio el juicio cabalmente contra Ríos Montt y los altos jefes militares de la época de las masacres, ¿verdad? Pero poco a poco la agenda de la justicia transicional ha sido anulada o minimizada por los gobiernos.
So, out of this effort in the Truth Commission's work and the Commission for the Study of Recovery of Historical Memory, there have been cases brought to trial, but they have been very few. And in many cases, justice has been frustrated. One of the most emblematic cases of this was the trial of General Rios Montt, who became president and led the government during the time of the greatest period of violence. And that trial did not result ultimately in his conviction, and he died before he could be retried, just of old age. And so the general point here is this last point, that while there was an agenda to achieve justice in this transition to democracy, justice for the human rights violations that had taken place before, the various governments that have come to power have not pushed this. They have minimized this.
La siguiente diapositiva, ya casi la final casi, pues vamos a ver cómo evaluar todo lo que se ha hecho. Y voy a plantear como un inicio, digamos, estas gráficas. En amarillo vamos a ver la cantidad de casos por lugar geográfico que se han exhumado. y en azul la cantidad de víctimas registradas en esa área, ¿verdad? Vamos a ver que esto varía de un lugar a otro, lo cual nos hace pensar que en realidad pues hace falta mucho trabajo que hacer en el campo, digamos, de la investigación forense y también de los juicios. Pero justicia transicional no necesariamente tiene que ver con juicios. Esto es fundamental, es parte importante de la justicia transicional, los juicios, ¿verdad? También tiene que ver con las exhumaciones y los procesos antropológicos forenses, pero tiene que ver también mucho con los procesos de salud mental en las comunidades, eh, la resolución de los conflictos que surgen en las comunidades a raíz de procesos sociales tan complejos y tan violentos como la contrainsurgencia y la paulatina toma del poder en las comunidades por el ejército, ¿verdad? También, producto de las operaciones militares, hubo muchos casos de niñez desaparecida donde todavía sus papás buscan a estos niños que hoy ya son personas adultas, ¿verdad? Es en realidad la agenda de, para la construcción de una posguerra mucho mejor ha sido abandonada por los gobiernos de turno eh, poco a poco, minimizándola o incluso a veces obstaculizándola, cerrando las instituciones del Estado que se encargan de estos temas eh, como una política de olvido o de negación de lo que sucedió. Listo, chao.
So the question posed here is how do we evaluate all of this? And what this map tells us, shows us, is the relevant quantities of exhumations, that is, where they have gone and dug and found and examined bodies, and of reports of victims in different areas. And so there's a considerable amount of variation about where these have happened and how many people have been uncovered in this way. And what it reminds us is that there's a tremendous amount of work still to be done. There are a tremendous number of areas that have not been examined, and a lot that would need to be done in order to bring people to justice. Um, he also tells us, or reminds us, that transitional justice is not just about judicial processes. There are many other dimensions to it. Um, Part of it is recovering the truth. It's knowing what happened, just so that we know, just so that we can understand what exactly happened. Um, it affects people's mental health quite a lot, knowing what happened to their loved ones, or just simply knowing that they're disappeared and not knowing anything else about them. So there's a tremendous about, amount of things that happen when animations are done and historical memory recovered, that don't necessarily have to do with trials. This also has to do with resolution of ongoing conflicts, because there are many conflicts at the community level over some of these things, and that has to be done. And by and large, the state has simply abandoned its role in many cases in pursuing this. It sometimes has actively obstructed those who wish to do this. It has undone or defunded the state organizations in charge of these kinds of things. It seems to be that the policy is a policy of forgetting rather than of recovery of historical memory.
Y para finalizar, vamos a la última diapositiva. Y cabalmente tengo que hablar de dos paisanos suyos. El primero, el Clyde Snow, obviamente él de Oklahoma, eh, enseñó en la Universidad de Oklahoma, ¿verdad? Muy famosa por haber fortalecido acá en Guatemala al equipo de antropología forense guatemalteco e incluso al equipo argentino también de antropología forense. Argentina también vivió procesos similares al guatemalteco, aunque no con violencia tan masiva, pero mucho del trabajo de Clyde Snow se dirigió a esto. No solamente fue un hombre de ciencia, sino que también estuvo vinculado a los derechos humanos. Y en el extremo derecho de la diapositiva miramos al padre Aplas o Francisco Rotter. pues obviamente él era el párroco de Santiago Atitlán y en 1981 es ejecutado por un comando estatal en la casa parroquial donde él vivía. Esto sucede en una época en la cual la violencia todavía no se había tornado a sus dimensiones masivas, sino era muy selectiva. Y obviamente en ese contexto, varios sacerdotes de la Iglesia Católica fueron visualizados como enemigos. Y lo mismo que le pasó al padre Aplas, hay un montón de otros casos de sacerdotes muy similares a él y su destino. Lo que me parece importante de estos dos personajes es que podemos ver que más allá de ser un hombre de ciencia o un hombre de religión, miramos que la personalidad de ambos llevó a que la ciencia pudiera ayudar a los derechos humanos y que la religión no solamente fuera como la conocemos, sino que la religión estuviera preocupada por la dignidad de las personas y los pueblos. Es tanto, Carlos, y muchas gracias por el espacio.
So we end the presentation with the memory of two Oklahomans, um, Clyde Snow, who was associated with the University of Oklahoma, among other things, who became one of the most prominent forensic anthropologists in the United States and even one might say in the world, um, and who led efforts to establish forensic anthropology teams in places like Argentina, and subsequently in Guatemala. Um, uh, Luis Rodrigo mentioned that in Argentina, the number of dead wasn't as massive as in Guatemala. Just to know that somewhere between 10,000 and 30,000 Argentines were disappeared and killed, whereas in Guatemala, the number is more like 200,000. So that's what he was referring to there. Um, and Clyde Snow really became famous around the world. He investigated the gas bombings by Saddam Hussein. He investigated war crimes in Serbia. He investigated war crimes in all sorts of parts of the world. And we have a Human Rights Award at the University of Oklahoma named after him. The other figure here is the Blessed Stanley Rother, a Catholic priest who went to work at the Oklahoma Diocese Mission in Santiago Atitlan in the 1960s and stayed there until 1981 when he was assassinated by government forces in the parish house. This was a time when the violence was emerging in the region that he was. He was defending the people with whom he lived and was killed for this reason. What Luis Rodrigo would like us to remember from this is that these two individuals, from their positions in science and positions in religion, in the church, were both characterized by this desire to defend and promote human rights. That is the thought with which he wanted to leave us. So he thanked us at the end. And we will continue on now with some comments. Jessica Cerezo Roman will, I don't know what I just did, but there we are. Well, we're jumping around here. Okay. Of the Department of Anthropology. She studies the human body and mortuary customs from ancient times, but also historic and modern context, including places in Arizona and Mayan sites, ancient burials in Belgium, Mongolia, Tunisia, and she's going to Greece this summer. She's also worked developing and testing methods used to analyze human remains, including as a forensic anthropologist postdoctoral fellow in Arizona, where they, among other things, were looking at people who had crossed the border and died in the process. She is also a consultant in the Tulsa Race Massacre Graves investigation. So, Jessica, we're very pleased to have you with us. Thank you for coming.
Thank you very much for the invitation, and thank you, Luis Rodrigo, for sharing your experiences with us. The Guatemala genocide is referred to as the Mayan genocide or the silent Holocaust. As you heard in this talk, massacres, forced disappearance, torture of thousands of people propagated by a military government. Human rights advocates have described these events as extraordinarily cruel actions, mostly against unarmed civilians. Thanks to survivors, community members, and families of the victims who never forgot these atrocities, and in collaboration with anthropologists, academics, scientists, the church, some of these victims' histories have been uncovered. As you heard in this talk, there is much to be done. From the science perspective in human rights, in forensic anthropology, we conduct a detailed examination of human remains to identify the individuals and determine how they die. We conduct excavation and exhumation of bodies to reconstruct how they were placed and concealed in clandestine graves. We analyze the human remains and determine the sex, the age at death, and the biological affinity. We can also estimate the height, the diseases that leave a mark on the skeleton, which is so important, as you see today in the cases in Guatemala, as well as the manner of death by analyzing traumas left in the skeleton, even when the bodies are burned and highly fragmented. We can tell some of their stories. A detailed and careful osteological analysis hold in the court of law, nationally and internationally, and also bring the remains home to their families. In the US, massacres and humanitarian crises have occurred, caused and fostered by politics and racism. For example, here in Oklahoma, a massacre took place on May 31st and June 1st in 1921 when mobs of white residents, many of them deputized and given weapons by city officials, attacked Black residents and businesses in the Greenwood district in Tulsa. The work done by the historian Dr. Scott Ellsworth tells us that we know by his work that this massacre was silenced by past governments and participants for many years. For that reason, many of you here in the audience never heard about the Tulsa Race Massacre until recently. But some community members, victims, and family of victims never forgot about the massacre. Community members, survivors, and family of the victims, in collaboration with academics, with students, with archaeologists, and forensic anthropologists like myself, have brought to life the investigation. And in this summer, we began the exhumation and the osteological analysis of possible victims. At least 7,000 people had died crossing the US Mexico international border, searching for a better life and escaping for violence from their countries, such as the violence in Guatemala. South of us, in Texas, approximately 3,000 people had lost their life while crossing. Many of these individuals did not receive autopsies. A collection of DNA samples was never taken and did not receive proper burial. Many of them will never be identified and their families will never know what happened to them. But currently, we have forensic anthropologists such as Dr. Kate Spradley that took an interest in these cases, and now her team is involved in the exhumation and analysis of some of these individuals with the hope to identify them and return them to their families. Similarly, in Arizona, in Tucson, one of my mentors, Dr. Bruce Anderson, has worked for many years on identifying people that die while crossing the border, and he has trained many students. Some of his students have made a significant contribution in identifying individuals and returning them to their families. Other students, such as Dr. Robin Reneke from the University of Arizona, have developed a non-profit, non-governmental organization that advocates for the decedent and their families' human rights. Families of victims, communities, and survivors cannot do this work alone. They need allies, people that care, that are willing to take a bit of time from their busy schedule to help with their skill, whatever it is. Academics, scientists, students, and even the general public can make a real difference in speaking for the dead, tell their stories, and advocate for their human rights. They can bring closure to survivors and family and bring justice to many communities. Thank you. I think now we are passing to the section of Q&A.
Thank you very much, Jessica, for those reflections and for helping us to see the connections between what has happened in the past and not very far away, but in Guatemala, and what is happened very close to us, but somewhat in the past, and what is still happening today. Again, not very far from us. I do have a few questions. If others would like to ask questions, this would be the last moment to enter those questions. A couple of things. One question is just a kind of a factual question. Some people have estimated the number of dead in the conflict in Guatemala as between 140 and 200,000. And one of the people wanted to know why do we not know with greater precision those numbers?
Bueno, la cifra oficial son 200,000 personas, pero hay dentro de estos 45,000 desaparecidos, y hay que tomar en cuenta también que todas las personas que aún están enterrados de manera clandestina o que sus mismas familias los enterraron eh, por muertes durante la persecución en las montañas, aún no cuentan con lo que jurídicamente se conoce como el papel, el acta de defunción, ¿verdad? La cifra de 200,000 se hace en base tanto a nivel testimonial como a nivel de reportes de entidades como Amnistía Internacional, Cruz Roja y otras instancias de derechos humanos.
So the official figure is around 200,000 dead. Of these, about 45,000 are those who have disappeared and whose bodies were never found. We would also have to consider those who were buried clandestinely in the mountains when the families fled, and for whom there's no death certificate or any sort of evidence of that kind. So there may be a significant number of people who have not been counted. The numbers that we have are carried out on the basis of testimonies, on some documentary evidence, and on organizations like Amnesty International and the Red Cross. So that's more or less where we are with the numbers. Another question had to do with how you as a person feel about this, how you relate to this. You have been an intimate participant in trying to understand and to uncover these truths and to give witness to this. What does that leave you as a person? What is it that you would like to see happen today?
Bueno, me interesaría ver algún día un proceso de reconciliación y de justicia transicional amplio, que sea prolongado en el tiempo. Hay muchas otras sociedades que han salido de conflictos y realmente los procesos de justicia transicional en el espectro amplio de la palabra duran décadas. Aquí lo triste es que la posguerra se basó en la negación de lo sucedido, en la obstaculización de los procesos jurídicos y en negar los testimonios de las personas que fueron afectadas por un bando o el otro. Algo que me deja un mal sabor de boca o cierta tristeza es darme cuenta del nivel de barbarie a que podemos llegar como seres humanos en realidad. Eh, el nivel de utilización que, que podemos tener como seres humanos de construir máquinas de matar. En realidad los ejércitos eh, tienen que cambiar su perspectiva o tal vez no existir, no sé, hay que pensarlo mucho, pero el, lo que se buscó en Guatemala, en realidad con todas estas luchas que sucedieron, porque no solamente la guerrilla estuvo intentando hacer cambios estructurales en el país, era construir un lugar más justo. Y tristemente a veces me doy cuenta que, que eso no es posible, o que es muy difícil, o que el costo es demasiado elevado cuando se trata de lograr estos cambios en el país. Y por último, también eh, miro que la realidad es muy similar a otros países de Latinoamérica y tal vez del mundo, ¿verdad? Y esto quiere también nos da un indicador de que es un proceso dialéctico. Por cada avance hay un retroceso y viceversa, pero eh, no creo que sea una cuestión tan fatídica esta tragedia que hemos vivido, sino que tenemos que sacar de ella, más que datos de horror, un aprendizaje social.
Okay.
Hablé mucho en español.
Sí, pero muy interesante. A ver, si puedo. Vamos a ver si puedo reconstruir eso. Entonces, what he was saying was that what he would like to see above all else would be true processes of reconciliation in Guatemala, of true processes of justice in Guatemala. We call post conflict processes such as these transitional justice, um, and these can last decades. And in some countries, we see this kind of effort going forth. What he feels sad about is that in Guatemala, the post war period consisted of the denial that these things happened, which I would say parenthetically is why the evidence from forensic anthropology is so important, because it doesn't allow you to deny what you can factually observe. But also that the governments of various governments obstructed the processes of justice and just tended to deny that any of these things took place. That was the attitude taken. And if he carries away an impression, it's of the barbarity, the level of barbarity that human beings can sink to in becoming murdering machines, killing machines. And this happened on different sides of the conflict. It wasn't just one side. And this leads him to think that this requires new thinking and new training for armed forces and those who exercise violence in the name of the state. He also wants to recall that what has been searching for, what he's been looking for, is what many Guatemalans have been looking for, which are changes in society to make it more just. And that has been the struggle all of these years through various different kinds of means. And sometimes when one looks at Guatemala, one feels that it is just not possible, that the cost is too high, that it can't be done. He notes, however, that Guatemala is not unique. It has its unique elements, but it is very similar to other countries in many ways, both in Latin America and in other countries. This to him is an indicator of overall historical processes of advances on the one hand, followed by backsliding and new advances. And he wants to take away from this not just a feeling like a fatalist attitude that nothing can be done, but that it is worth one's life to stand up for justice and to continue to seek it. I hope that summarized it adequately. The way he expressed it in Spanish was a little bit more eloquent than that. With that comment, we do reach now the end of our time, which is unfortunate. I think it would be, if this were an in-person event, some people would go home and a bunch of people would stand around now and have conversations afterwards. But before we go, I do want to ask you to thank our speakers. Luis Rigo Salvador, I just misspelled his name there, but there's an L in it as well, and Jessica Cerezo Roman. And also to remember that there are others who help make this possible, including Stephanie Sager, Maura McAndrew, and Michaela Chamon, who help make this possible in various ways through Helping Planet, through the flyer design, through reaching out and communicating to people about this, and various kinds of technical assistance with Zoom and such. Last, I would like to remind you or announce to you the last event that will take place for the Center of the Americas this semester. And this is a book presentation by Krista Brun. And she has written a book about travels, translations, and the literary imagination of Brazil in the Americas. And our own Paulo Moreira will be offering a response to her presentation. That is 2 weeks from today on the 30th of April at the same time from 3 to 4:30. So thank you very much for giving us your time. We know that at this part of the semester it gets more and more difficult to set time aside for events, but thank you very much for coming, and we hope to see you again at another event.
See you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Luis Rodrigo.
Okay.
Thank you very much.